Hello and welcome to my channel, or if you are a returning subscriber, welcome back. This video is the start of a new playlist series called The History Colonial Institutions Won't Teach You. Real people, real stories of Macedonian child refugees in the Greek Civil War. This playlist is entirely dedicated to providing audio-visual representations or animations of real accounts or testimonies of Macedonians during the Greek Civil War, 1946 to 49. When a significant percentage of the Macedonian population was cleansed from Aegean Macedonia. This video is a representation of Vasil Delianov's oral testimony. Full references will be cited in the description box below. Vasil Delianov was born in 1933 in the village Bapchor, in Aegean Macedonia. He left as a child refugee in April 1948, aged 15 years, and arrived in Australia in 1956, aged 23 years. And now, after that brief introduction, without further ado, let's begin the animation movie of Vasil's story. Please also don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content.
My village Bapchor is in the bosom of Vichoplanina, which is a mountain that stretches for a good length across Macedonia and is over 2,000 meters above sea level. It's been 50 years since I was in my village, and that is a long time in a man's life. Our old people used to tell us that originally there were 3 smaller villages which were settled toward the end of the 11th century and the beginning of the 12th. Their names were Zornitsa, Selisha and Kozyak. But because of brigands and others who created problems, the villages were very insecure. Now it is said that at the place where I was born, today's village of Bapchor, there lived our great ancestor Dedobach. On that site, halfway up the mountain, he had a sheepfold. Now he was big and heroic. He told the people of the 3 villages that where he was located, he could see who was approaching from every direction. He suggested that the villages resettle as one village on the same site because they could more easily protect themselves from enemies and would also be able to welcome friends from afar. This was in the middle of the 17th century, in 1650 to be precise. I remember this because 1650 was written into the mortar of a village house. There was some resistance from the villagers, especially Zornitsa, but Dedobach convinced them with brute strength. He was reputed to be very fierce. Today, there are still signs of the earlier settlements in the area. There were many huts built by the shepherds from earlier centuries, which still stand. The village has always been Macedonian. This century, it bothered the Greeks that our people didn't want to adopt Greek customs and the Greek language. They would rather die than accept the Greek language as their own. There are some statistics available that tell us that in 1913, 1,130 people inhabited the village and that there were about 250 houses. In times of peace, the village really prospered. There were a few tradespeople, such as saddle makers, tailors and shoemakers, but mostly the people worked the land and bred sheep, cattle and goats. The village was generally self-sufficient, supplying most of its needs such as wool, milk, meat, fruit and vegetables, and especially rye. They had to go to either Lerin or Kostur for fish and salt. My childhood was very unhappy because it was a time of war. This is an experience I don't want another child to go through. They were bad years, people died, and there was massive chaos most of the time. I was the 3rd child of 5. I had an older sister and brother and 2 younger brothers. My parents were extremely poor. My father left for Australia in 1937, and there is no memory of him in my childhood. The winters were very cold, and there was a lot of snow. But when spring came, it was beautiful. It really was a beautiful natural environment with its green trees, flowers, and beautiful scents. In the warm weather, we used to sleep out in the open. Our family looked after sheep and some cattle, and it was a great joy to put them out to pasture. We looked after our animals as if they were humans. I remember very little about the big social functions in the village, such as weddings. But I do recall people dancing and singing in the center of the village. We always sang Macedonian songs, and no one sang in Greek. We used to sing revolutionary songs like When we were forced to go to school to learn in Greek, we had to reject what we were taught. Our Greek teachers, for instance, would order us to say kalimera, good day in Greek, to our relatives. As kids, we thought we had to do as our teachers told us. But when we greeted our grandparents or others with kalimera, they would reply in Macedonian with a rhyme to the Greek word "Shovelish data isera," which is a jokingly vulgar response which translates to, "What are you saying? You want to be pooed on?" When this question was asked in our language, we didn't repeat the kalimera greeting again. Such were the times. It is not easy to forget terrible things that have happened to you. The Civil War, which started in 1946, became more intense around 1948 and claimed more and more victims. The aeroplanes flew over us every day. These and other sophisticated arms and weapons were given to the Greek government forces by America and England. Greece did not have much industry. Everything that moved was bombed, including animals. So the Communist Party of Greece decided that the children should be sent on to the communist countries where they would be safe and many of the mothers would be freed up to help the partisans. Discussions had taken place with the villagers earlier, and the party decision was made on March 4th. On March 30th of that same year, my mother left the village with my two younger brothers to go off into foreign lands. I was left behind as a momok, a live-in hired hand for a woman in our village whose 3 grown-up sons had gone to the mountains with the partisans. When my brothers and all the other children had left, I was happy because I thought I would have all the cherries, apples, and other good fruit all to myself. But when all the children but a few had left, I saw how Bapchor went for them. The village was deserted of young people. When I went to take the sheep to pasture, there were no other boys to talk to while away the time. Now, I didn't care whether I was given all the apples, pears, or sweets in the world. I just wanted to get away from there. I was watching for an opportunity to leave the place myself. After the first exodus of mothers and children who arrived in the village of Zornitsa, a few women returned back to our village of Bapchor to collect us, having witnessed that children my age and older were also fleeing. We left at midnight, and our first stop was the village of Konomladi, where we ate a little and rested. Then we moved on to the village of Zornitsa, traveling only at night to avoid being spotted and bombarded by the bombers overhead. At Zornitsa, I caught up with my mother and 2 brothers, and the whole group stayed there for 2 or 3 days. Then we moved on to the village of Jelevo, and I will remember it as a black spot on my heart because we were separated from our mothers. It was a very emotional parting. We were taken to the Republic of Macedonia, then part of the newly formed Yugoslav Federation. We were moved around to different places, but as I was illiterate, even though I was 14 years old, I don't have a memory of the places and their names. We went to Lubojno, but as there were 3,000 or 4,000 kids already there, they sent us back to the village of Dupeni. There were about 230 refugee children from my village alone. All this time, apart from some partisans who accompanied the groups, there were women who acted as our mothers. These were often men widowed by the war, whose husbands had died in the struggle and had children of their own in the group. Sometimes they were young, unmarried women, but we had to call them mother, just the same. Eventually, they took us to Bitola by truck. There, some wonderful patriots met us from our village and gave us all the help we needed. I should mention 2 excellent men, Vasil Vasilov, who was the village photographer, and Tanas Nizamov. Tanas gave us a wonderful reception, as he was the man who kept us in contact with our parents, especially when they migrated to Australia and we were scattered in the communist countries. Some of us were illiterate and had no way of communicating or making contact. I don't know how many days we stayed in Bitola, but from there we put on a train and taken off into the night. Most of the children found this terrifying, as they had never seen a train before, let alone traveled in one. We were never told where we were being taken from the moment we left the village. But I remember we went through Serbian territory to Belgrade and then on to Romania. In a small village called Vatsa, the Romanians who took charge of us completely cut off our hair, washed us in some hot mineral springs and gave us a change of clothes. We could barely recognize each other because we looked so different. Both the boys and the girls were given the same treatment. We all had been itchy with lice and some skin disease, the name of which I don't know. That's why they burnt our old clothes. During our stay in Vatsa, which was for nearly a year, one of my brothers and I came down with typhus. we were sent to a huge hospital in a large town called Arad, where we were treated very well and recovered fully. At the time, my brother and I were in hospital. A Red Cross delegation formed of women came from France to see what had happened to the refugee children from the Greek Civil War. There were also some mothers from the villages who came with those French women. Apparently, Queen Frederica of Greece was complaining to the world that the communists had taken away her children. When we were in the villages, the royalist forces rained bombs and bullets on us. But she wanted to show the world she loved us by telling everyone that the communists took away her children. The ladies from France found out that we were alive and well, our only problem being that we had great difficulty with the Romanian language, which none of us knew. It was to give us a formal education that we were transferred to Tulgesh at age 16, near the Hungarian border in the Carpathian Mountains. We were still in Romania, but most of the inhabitants spoke Hungarian. This village was a huge colony for children, with very modern amenities and sleeping quarters. They taught us Romanian, but also our mother tongue. We Macedonians had to learn both Macedonian and Greek. All of the children were either Macedonian or Greek. I must say that at this place, the Macedonian national feeling really developed. We had teachers who were great patriots from the villages of Dumbeni and Vumbel, the Costa region of what is now Greece. They not only taught us the Macedonian language, but also a lot about Macedonian culture and history. We learned and sang Macedonian songs and performed plays. The school program lasted from morning till evening. Life was pretty good then, even though we lived like soldiers in an army barracks. It was a happy time, and I have very good memories of it. Then, late in 1950, age 17, just before the new year started, some of the older boys, which included me, were sent to Trgovište, a town close to the Yugoslav border. The school was a practical and technical school, complete with dormitories, canteen, and factory area. It was modeled on the schools of the Soviet Union at the time, and everything was new. Most of the students were Romanian, and the Macedonian, Greek students, were a small number. We had older Greek communist cadres in charge of our refugee group of students at this school. They did us more harm than good. They constantly propagandized against the situation in Greece, where the partisans had been defeated by now. They gave us graphic descriptions of the hideous tortures and executions in the political prisons of Greece. Also, these same Greek communists resented the progress Macedonian national feeling had made among the Macedonian refugees. At the technical school, we did very little study of the Macedonian language. Romanian and Russian were the main languages, and we could choose vocations such as turner and fitter, carpenter, blacksmith, and so forth. There was a Greek who big-noted himself with the communists and was put in a position of responsibility. I wanted to be a turner and fitter, and he told me I had to be a blacksmith. When I asked him why, he said that I had a big mouth which sang Macedonian songs. Here, he was deciding our fate. I finished the 2-year course successfully as a blacksmith, but never practiced it anywhere in the world. All this time, I thought of my mother back in the village. I especially thought about her and missed her very much at the early stages when I was in Vatsa. But as I couldn't write, it was very difficult to contact her. I had started to learn reading and writing in the Macedonian language in Tulgesh, but had enormous difficulty because I was so grown up and did not have a basis in literacy of any sort. While I thought about my relatives when I was in Romania, the prospect of going home and being bossed around by the Greeks was not something I looked forward to. It looked terrible to me then to go back to a situation where you can't be who you are. As I have already said, when I spoke about life in the village, the Greeks wanted us to forget our Macedonian language and traditions and adopt everything Greek. In 1936, conditions were atrocious for Macedonia and its people. Metaxas ruled by military dictatorship. Our names had been changed to Greek surnames earlier, but now they tried to stamp out all talk in the Macedonian language. The police would listen at windows, break in violently, and grab people by the tongue. There were beatings, imprisonments, and whatnot. Towards the end of 1952, at age 19, some of us were sent on to study forestry in a city called Craiova, close to Yugoslavia. There wasn't much of a forest there, but it was others who decided our fate. The Ministry of Education's intention was for us to study forestry. But because none of us had this sort of background, we ended up studying diesel mechanics. Anyway, we had a good time at that place, and I graduated with a certificate. In the meantime, sometime during 1952, my father, who was a pechelbar, a Macedonian term for a breadwinner in the family who travels abroad to earn money and return, in Australia, made an application through the Red Cross to locate his children and bring them out to Australia. My mother had fled to Yugoslavia with my older brother. The village of Bapchor, together with many other villages which supported the partisans, had been burnt to the ground by the Greek royalist forces who won the war with the help of the Americans and British. My father had already brought my mother and older brother to Australia earlier in 1950. The Greek communists who were in charge of us in Romania were not willing to let us go to parents who had emigrated to capitalist countries. They did not tell us exactly what was said and how the Red Cross contacted them. It was all a bit indirect and shifty. We were told there was talk about us, the refugee children, going to America, Canada, or Australia. But they said that the Communist Party of Greece insisted that if Greece were liberated, we would be needed back there to run the country. After all, they said, so much money and effort was spent in educating us to make good communist cadres out of us. So instead of contacting our parents ourselves, those in charge wrote back to the parents saying we didn't want to leave Romania. But in reality, they just didn't want to let us go. That is the truth. This created many unnecessary delays. In the meantime, my mother died of heart disease in 1954 in Australia. My mother passed away with thoughts of her children constantly on her mind. If the Greeks in Romania hadn't delayed me, I would have seen her. But the ice had broken in the immediate years following the initial contact of the Red Cross, and many of the former refugees began to leave. In 1955, I contacted the Red Cross personally, and in spite of delays that made me angry, I was allowed to leave with a group of others. We went across Hungary by train to Austria, where we were placed in a refugee camp for a few months. After that, we traveled to Trieste in Italy, where we waited for a ship to take us to Australia. In Trieste, we were questioned individually by American officials. They asked us about whether we worked in munitions factories and other related military questions. In Romania, we had lived a peaceful life where we were taught to cooperate with each other, not to worry about the color of a person's skin, to be a good man, and to live in peace with your neighbors. I don't remember the date exactly, but we caught the ship Flaminia and sailed for over a month to Australia. It was a terrible trip. It nearly took the life out of us. The food wasn't very good, the wine seemed artificial, and anyway, in Romania we hadn't touched alcohol in all our years there. But there were some compensations. We were a group of young men and women and enjoyed each other's company. I was about 23 at the time. There is one important episode I should mention from on board the ship. There was a central loudspeaker and radio with a gramophone on the ship, and the crew had invited us to play our own records. We put on a beautiful Macedonian song called Eleno, Mome and danced to it. Not long after, we were told the record had been broken by Greeks. Now the Romanian and Russian records hadn't been broken, just the Macedonian one. On the way out, the ship had picked up 700 young unmarried Greek women from the port of Piraeus. There was a Greek priest on the ship who acted as a chaperone for these women. Suspicion naturally fell on him, but it was never proven. I knew nothing about Australia. All I knew was that my father and uncles were doing well in Australia because they were no longer as poor as we were in the village. On the ship, they showed us some films about Australia and tried to teach us some English. But I wasn't happy learning English because I hated the British. It was they who had given the bombs and weapons to the Greeks to destroy us. When I got to Australia, I woke up in a country where I didn't understand a single word of the language, but I was determined to learn it very quickly. My first impression was that if I didn't learn to communicate in the local language, I would get nowhere with Romanian and Macedonian. You have to learn the language of the country you find yourself in and get into the culture. We lived in Hawthorne with my family, and I had to go all the way to Sunshine by train to work. On the train, I constantly looked at a Bulgarian English dictionary, which was close enough to the languages I already knew, so that I could make out the English. While I have never completely mastered English, I have reached the point where I can fill out my tax returns and go to any service like the doctor's surgery or immigration office without needing an interpreter. My first meeting, at age 23, with my father, whom I had not remembered as a child because he had migrated to Australia in 1937, was very emotional. It was very sad as we kissed and embraced because the boys had grown up without a father, and my mother, who gave her life for the family, was no longer with us and did not see us. Our family got involved with the Macedonian community, which was centered in the suburb of Fitzroy. In Fitzroy Town Hall, there used to be film nights, regular dances, and all kinds of social activities where Macedonians would get together. When I first arrived, there was already talk of a Macedonian Orthodox church being consecrated, and this happened in 1960 in Young Street, Fitzroy, called St. George. From those early days till today, my family have always been members of the Macedonian community in Melbourne. All our social life has been bound up with it, even though we live in Australia. I also followed the soccer, supporting Preston Macedonia as an active member of the social club. I also helped, together with many other people, to raise money for the purchase of the park in West King Lake, where the monastery of St. Mome of Ohrid was built. We all pitched in to clear the land because it was wild bush when we first bought it, and planted the type of trees we wanted. I also helped dig the ground where the monastery was built. We all worked in a voluntary capacity to help as much as we could because the builder was very expensive. As I mentioned, the first job I got was in Sunshine. This was at Ferguson's Tractors. Thanks to a Serbian worker at that factory, I got a job as a spray painter. I had never heard of spray painter in Romania, but I knew a bit about tractors from the Romanian technical school, so I worked alongside a Ukrainian guy who had fled from the communists in the Soviet Union. We spoke Russian and got on really well, even though he was anti-communist, and I had been brought up and educated by the communists. Later, I changed jobs and went to Foy's and Gibson in Collingwood. We used to get lots of breaks at work, and that was how I got to know my future wife. She was a pretty girl, and I had heard a lot about her from an auntie who was one of her relatives. I knew her history from this aunt who told me that the Greeks had executed the girl's father. I found out that she was from a family where there was a Macedonian priest. That was her great-grandfather, who was a priest in the Bulgarian church of the village, which also had a Greek church. The Macedonians did not have an independent church in those days. This history made me very sympathetic to the girl. It wasn't long before I married her and brought her to live in Hawthorne with my father and two brothers. In 1966, one of my younger brothers, Tome, who was married with two children, died of a blood clot. Medical knowledge wasn't as good then as it is today. We lived in Hawthorne for about 13 years. Our three children, Sophie, Philip and James, were all born there. In 1969, when a huge block of flats was built next door to us, we shifted to Reservoir. Our kids grew up in Reservoir, but went to school in Lalor. In 1990, I wanted to build something really comfortable for my old age, and bought a block in Mill Park. In 1992, I supervised the building of the house myself, and had worked out the plan with one of my sons. I had plenty of time on my hands as I had been retrenched from work, which was the result of import tariffs being dropped in the textile and footwear industry the previous year. So I used to come to the block and would dig and work away during all my spare time. In 9 months, the house was ready, and we have lived in this peaceful and lovely part of Whittlesea ever since. I have no complaints. I have always loved my children deeply and spared no sacrifice to see them happy. I think the upbringing I had in the refugee homes and schools in Romania had an important influence in this regard. We had been taught that the greatest capital is the human being. We were taught to value people more than material possessions or anything else. As a parent, I have been more like a friend or comrade to my children. This has been a very important value to me. Now, I see the future as being bright for the young people, and we, the elderly, can live in hope of a better world. It is good to see that the situation between Greece and Macedonia has been more or less resolved over there. They have exchanged embassies and have begun trading. The Greek reaction was dreadful when Macedonia first declared independence in 1991. Greece closed the borders, boycotted all trade, cut off all relations, and was determined to destroy the new nation. I am glad to say things are better now. Yet regrettably, here in Australia, the Greek propaganda against the Macedonians hasn't stopped. Because of the Greek influence locally, we still don't have a Macedonian consul in Australia. There are many things that need to be improved here. Discrimination has to stop. and is especially bad and dangerous in a country with so many different ethnic groups. One thing I have always thought about, whether I was in Romania or Australia, has been my village of Bapchor. I can understand why the Australian Aborigines talk of sacred sites or sacred land. The Greeks have changed its name to Pymnion, which is supposed to mean sheep in ancient Greek. I am not interested in either sheep or goats. I would like to visit the village if it is called Bapchor, and the Macedonians are given full respect and recognition. I had Bapchor written as my birthplace on my passport 42 years ago, and that's how it will stay. And it is precisely this lack of recognition from the Greeks which bothers me so much and makes it impossible for me to go back to see the village. But I still yearn for its beautiful natural surroundings.
Thank you if you have come this far and are still watching. Vasil's story is unfortunately one of approximately 30,000 children who were child refugees from Aegean Macedonia. Whilst there were Greek children too, the vast majority of these refugees were Macedonians. This series is especially dedicated to them because Greece and its allies in the Greek Civil War have still not been held accountable for the war crimes that were committed against the Macedonian population, nor has there ever been an apology from the modern Greek state for the irreparable damage caused to these children and their families. Instead, Macedonians continue to face ethnic denial both at home, in colonized Aegean Macedonia, and abroad in countries Macedonian refugees fled to, like Australia and other Western Allied countries where Greeks have sizable lobbying powers. Macedonian refugees from Aegean Macedonia tend to still have title ownership of their properties, but they cannot return to Greece to reclaim it without changing their identity. And so, many Macedonian properties remain like those found in Bapchor today. Title claims in limbo, properties in ruins from the Allied bombing offensives, and a foreign name for their villages and cities. What we can see from the sources I have provided already, and Vasil's account, whether it's breaking a Macedonian gramophone disc on deck, or cancelling a football match to avoid Preston Macedonia getting popular, Greek chauvinists take every opportunity to discriminate against and mistreat Macedonians. And this is exactly what this series is about. It's to teach the world the real history of the Greek Civil War and to expose the ongoing discrimination Macedonians face. Thanks again for watching, and if you enjoy my content, then please make sure to like and subscribe to my channel.